On March 27, 2020, OneWeb filed for bankruptcy. A couple of months later, the UK government and an Indian conglomerate named Bharti Enterprises would bail out OneWeb, pitching in $500 million each. This bailout attracted additional investment into OneWeb, which will likely keep the company alive for a few more years. But with juggernauts like SpaceX, Amazon, Apple, and even Facebook competing in the space, why is OneWeb even trying? Before we get into the video, let's make it clear that none of us want to see OneWeb fail. Competition and multiple options in the market is always a good thing for the consumer. With that being said though, OneWeb's chances in the satellite internet business aren't the best. So let's take a look at how OneWeb got to where they are today and why they're at a massive disadvantage. OneWeb was originally founded in 2012 with the name Worldview. At the start, the company was actually quite conservative, as they simply looked to launch 20 satellites operating at 20 different orbital planes. One of the most significant factors going for OneWeb in the early days was the team behind it. Most of the early employees were extremely talented individuals who left Google to try growing their own company. Talent wasn't their only advantage though. OneWeb was also quickly building up partnerships with leaders in the space. In November of 2014, news broke that OneWeb was trying to secure a partnership with SpaceX. The companies were looking to build a factory together that could produce high-volume, low-cost satellites. No deal would go through though, likely because of Musk's vision for Starlink. Since OneWeb couldn't form a deal with SpaceX, they would put out the satellite manufacturing contract in the market, and they would garner bids from a couple of notable companies including Airbus and Lockheed Martin. In the meantime, OneWeb would also onboard a couple of notable investors, including the Virgin Group and Qualcomm. These new partners and investments would allow OneWeb to significantly scale up their satellite vision to 720 satellites in orbit. By the end of 2016, SoftBank would invest as well, pouring in a massive $1 billion and grabbing a 40% stake in the company. At the time, all of this hype seemed justified. In February of 2017, OneWeb announced that they had already sold nearly all of their communication capacity. So, OneWeb would further expand their plans to add another 1,972 satellites. Everything was just plans though. OneWeb was yet to launch a single satellite. This, however, would change in February of 2019, when OneWeb launched 6 test satellites on a Soyuz rocket. After this test launch though, OneWeb wouldn't do another launch for an entire year, with the next launch occurring in February of 2020. They would go ahead and do one more launch in March of 2020, but as we discussed at the beginning, this is when they would file for bankruptcy. The pandemic introduced massive uncertainty within the investment world, and OneWeb's investors were reluctant to pour in more money. OneWeb did try their best to avoid bankruptcy by significantly cutting back on their workforce, going from 531 employees to just 74. This was of course not enough though. Fortunately for OneWeb, they would get a bailout, and as uncertainty about the pandemic loosened, their initial investors would pour in additional funding. This funding has allowed them to complete a couple more launches, bringing up the total operational satellite count to 176. OneWeb anticipates that they almost have enough funding to launch their entire 648 Gen 1 satellite fleet. Right now, they are about $300 million short, but they don't think raising this money will be an issue. So that's basically the state of OneWeb today. They've made a significant recovery since their bankruptcy, and it looks like their first set of satellites will be fully operational within the next couple of years. That's the good part. Unfortunately, there's bad parts too, with the first being a lack of leverage. The main competitors in the satellite internet business are of course SpaceX and Blue Origin, and they both have massive leverage. As for SpaceX, their key point of leverage is vertical integration. They make their own satellites, they make their own rockets, and they launch their own rockets. Nearly every single step along the way is controlled completely by SpaceX, which significantly reduces cost as they cut out the middlemen. With OneWeb, on the other hand, they're a middleman in everything. They don't make their own satellites, they don't make their own rockets, and they don't conduct their own launches. They rely on other companies or countries to accomplish all of this for them, which surely costs much more. This lack of vertical integration will basically make it impossible for OneWeb to compete against Starlink's pricing. Something else to consider is that OneWeb also doesn't have a massive fanbase or mission that millions of people around the world resonate with. SpaceX is trying to colonize Mars, and I'm sure that a significant proportion of the satellite internet market will choose SpaceX over the competition just to support their mission. As for Blue Origin/Amazon, Jeff Bezos was also trying to take the vertically integrated route. But recently, Amazon announced that they were going to rely on ULA to launch their first set of satellites. It looks like Jeff Bezos still wants to use Blue Origin for launches in the future. However, they're settling with ULA in the meantime to prevent SpaceX from building too large of a lead. This doesn't really matter though, as Amazon's point of leverage was never vertical integration. Amazon's key leverage is their massive Prime subscriber base, who love their services and love their customer support even more. While I'm sure space enthusiasts will almost always pick SpaceX over Amazon, I'm not sure the average person really cares. And it's very likely that Amazon can find large success within this demographic, which is just looking for the most convenient option. So, unlike their competitors, OneWeb doesn't really have strong leverage within the market. More importantly though, OneWeb can't afford to fail. Their near-death experience during the pandemic basically proves this point. You guys may have heard about Facebook and Apple and other large corporations' ambitions to compete against SpaceX and Amazon. These late entrants have similar shortfalls to OneWeb. They don't have manufacturing capability or advanced rocket technology. But what they do have is the ability to fail. Apple has roughly $200 billion in cash, and Facebook has about $65 billion in cash. So neither company would really be hurt by burning a couple billion or even $10 billion on trying to launch their own satellite internet. If they do succeed though, the reward would be quite large, meaning that their risk-to-reward ratio is extremely favorable. SpaceX also has massive margins to fail. I mean, just take a look at how many times Starship prototypes had to explode before SpaceX nailed the landing. The thing is, investors are much more okay with burning money on revolutionary rocket technology that could take us to Mars. With OneWeb though, if the constellation doesn't generate enough demand, or if they have some sort of technical failure within their constellation, I'm not sure how long investors would realistically stick around for. And that brings us into the last major disadvantage for OneWeb, which is an ugly track history. When I say that OneWeb has an ugly track history, I'm not referring to OneWeb specifically, but rather the satellite internet business in general. Satellite internet is not a new idea by any means. Companies have been trying to launch satellite internet but failing for decades at this point. A perfect example of this is Teledesic. Teledesic was actually a project backed by Bill Gates and mobile tycoon Craig McCaw way back in the 1990s. Given the people behind the project, Teledesic was easily able to breeze past funding and regulation. However, after seeing lackluster demand for satellite services, Teledesic was shut down in the early 2000s. Similarly, Iridium Communications was a satellite service business that filed for bankruptcy in 1999, well before the dot-com bubble even burst. They are still around today, but they haven't really made any money over the last 22 years. Another satellite business that flopped is Globalstar, and there are several more notable examples. Considering the checkered past of the satellite services industry, many people doubt that even SpaceX and Amazon can successfully pull off satellite internet. Whether they do or not, there's no doubt that's been a tough journey for them as well. This uncertainty is simply magnified when we take a look at a startup like OneWeb, and why it seems like OneWeb doesn't even have a chance. While all of that criticism is completely fair and accurate, there are a couple of factors going for OneWeb, such as their self-awareness. OneWeb knows that competing against SpaceX and Amazon in the consumer industry, where brand image is extremely important, is basically futile. That's why they're not targeting this market. In March of 2021, OneWeb announced that their primary target audience was businesses, governments, phone network operations, and clusters of communities. By avoiding the large consumer market, OneWeb is largely able to avoid competing against SpaceX and Amazon directly. Moreover, by targeting commercial customers, OneWeb can reduce their customer base to a few customers who pay a lot, which will likely be much easier to handle than 10 million mainstream consumers. At the end of the day, OneWeb doesn't really shine in any one category. They don't have vertical integration or a moving mission or tens of billions to burn through. The history of satellite businesses failing also doesn't bode too well for them. Hopefully, by concentrating on niche commercial customers which the big players aren't that interested in, OneWeb will find some success. But we'll just have to wait and see. Do you guys think OneWeb has a chance? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you guys hope OneWeb succeeds. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.